record this as well. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name is Connor Goodwin, and I'm a communications manager at ProPublica. Immigration is a top concern among voters this election year, and today's event is the first in a three-part series examining America's divisive attitudes over immigration. The series will delve into the immigration system, the U.S. economy's reliance on migrant labor, and border enforcement. Today's event, in partnership with the Texas Tribune, will focus on the consequential aftermath of the Trump and Biden administration's shifting immigration policies, particularly around Title 42, an emergency federal code that allowed officials to turn migrants away. Joining me is Perla Trevizo, a reporter for the ProPublica Texas Tribune Investigative Initiative. Born in Ciudad Juárez and raised in El Paso, Perla has covered the border and immigration for over a decade. Thanks, Perla. So to start, your most recent investigation is centered around one of the deadliest incidents involving immigrants in Mexico's history, a detention center fire in Ciudad Juárez that claimed the lives of 40 men. The tragedy was widely covered when it occurred last year. What made you want to take a closer look?
Yes, I had been following the shifting policies for years, and this increasing reliance on Mexico and countries further south to stop people from getting to the U.S. in the first place, and wondering what were the consequences of that. When the fire happened, you were hearing a lot about this is a result of U.S. policies, and I really wanted to see how that all played together. So when you put everything on the timeline, when you see the warnings in forms of letters or reports, when you see the policies, when you see the results of those policies, what does that picture look like? And so I spent months putting together, from various documents such as Department of State human rights reports, Congressional Research Service reports, letters that lawmakers were writing to the administration, in reports from researchers on both sides of the border, human rights organizations, et cetera. So when you put all of that together, it's clear that the concerns of what could potentially happen were widely known. There were concerns about corruption within Mexico's migration system. There were concerns about human rights violations and no one being held accountable. There were concerns about detention center conditions, particularly on the Mexican side of the border, crime perpetrated by organized crime, but also by local law enforcement. And so when you put all that together, you do see this buildup increasing, and the pressure increases in places like Juárez, that until recently it was a kind of a pass-through city where migrants would pass through on their way to the U.S., or Mexican deportees would pass through on their way to their home states, but it hadn't been a place where migrants were stranded for long periods of time, and it was not prepared to handle that increased flow. It did not have many shelters. It didn't have as many NGOs. It did not have the infrastructure to hold people. And you kind of see that pressure building and building up as these policies not only remain in place, but also expand.
Yeah. And you kind of hinted at it, but can you speak a little bit more to some of the warning signs you uncovered in the course of reporting?
Yeah, so I think, I went back over a decade. So I think it's important to say that we focus on the period with Trump and President Biden, but this increased enforcement on the South and pressure towards Mexico, or relying on Mexico, precedes Trump and Biden. Even under Obama, you had this program called Frontera Sur, which increased enforcement, but on Mexico, but on the southern side. We focus precisely on Trump and Biden, particularly because for the first time under President Trump, you saw policies that sent people, non-Mexican nationals, back to Mexico. So you had the so-called Remain in Mexico policy first, where Mexico agreed for the first time to take people who were not Mexicans, who were being sent back by the U.S. government, so their asylum cases could be processed, and they were asked to wait in Mexico while their asylum cases were processed. And then we saw, as you mentioned, Title 42 with the start of the pandemic, that allowed the U.S. government to expel most people to their countries or to Mexico. And so the warning signs, start from a decade ago. You see from human rights reports from the State Department, for instance, about concerns and issues happening in Mexico around migrants. And then starting in 2019, you start seeing also fires similar to the one that we saw in Juárez, where migrants would lit mattresses or blankets in fire as a form of protest regarding like unsanitary conditions and overcrowding conditions in detention centers in Mexico. Lawmakers on this side, continue to write to the administration, including to President Biden. 2 months, before the fire, there was a letter they sent out saying we have serious concerns about the impact that these policies are having. And the Congressional Research Service, 2 weeks before the fire, released a report in which it says that, despite reform efforts, the Mexican Migration Institute retains a reputation for corruption and weak observance of migrant protections. And as a result, migrants remain vulnerable to crime and other abuses, and how this had placed them at greater risk of harm.
Yeah. And then when you wrote to the Biden administration for comment, how did they respond?
So when we reached out to the White House and the administration, they did not address specific questions to the role the U.S. policies had or not had on the fire. But they did say that, the detention center was outside the jurisdiction of the United States, and pointed to the legal pathways that the administration had created. For instance, this includes the use of the CBP-1 app. So basically, people who want an opportunity to present themselves at a port of entry now can use this mobile application run by the government, where there's a number of appointments daily, and they have to try every day until they get one of those appointments. Unfortunately, one of the unintended consequences of this application is that it can still take months for people to get one of these appointments. In the meantime, they're stranded in places in northern Mexico or Mexico City. And so even though the administration pointed to this as a potential solution, it did not acknowledge that some of the migrants, the victims of the fire, were in fact waiting for an appointment through this app when they were swept by Mexican authorities, including Stefan, one of the victims of the fire that we center our story on. He's a migrant from Venezuela. He had been in Juárez waiting for one of the appointments with his sister when Mexican migration authorities picked him up the day of the fire.
Yeah, and accompanying your story, we also produced a short documentary, and we have a 1-minute trailer here that I will play for you in just a second.
And while you're playing that, the documentary actually follows a Venezuelan family who's trying to secure one of the CBP-1 appointments. And you can kind of see the challenge that they're going through and what happens after they manage to secure an appointment.
Yeah. All right, here it is.
To understand what a city like Ciudad Juárez is like for migrants right now, it all starts with Title 42.
It allows the U.S. to expel migrants over public health concerns.
Nearly 8 million Venezuelans have fled their country, amounts to the largest displacement crisis ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere.
The right way right now is through the U.S. government's CBP-1 app.
Yo no sabía nada de esa aplicación, pero esa responsabilidad quedó a mí. Uno todos los días está esperanzado de que hoy sí cae la cita, pero yo siempre tuve esa fe, o tal vez porque mi mamá está de aquel lado.
A veces pasan cosas que, bueno, uno no quisiera que pasaran, pero pasan.
No ha migrado tanto y hemos caminado tanto. Llegar uno y estar aguarado no es la idea tampoco.
Tantas cosas que uno pasa para venir hasta acá. Ellos ni se lo imaginan.
And I will share a link to that doc you can watch on our website shortly. But first, I want to introduce today's panelists. So in the second part of this hour, we're going to invite on a couple experts. Andrew Seeley is president of the Migration Policy Institute, a global nonpartisan institution that seeks to improve immigration and integration policies. His research focuses on migration globally, with a special emphasis on immigration policies in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Maureen Meyer is the vice president for programs at the Washington office on Latin America. She has over 2 decades of experience addressing human rights, U.S. security cooperation, border security, migration, and asylum issues, and works closely with various human rights and migrant rights organizations and networks in Latin America. And then Dr. Victor Monjarez is the University of Texas at El Paso's Export Control Officer and Director of the Center for Law and Human Behavior. Monjarez previously worked for the U.S. Border Patrol for 22 and a half years and was the chief patrol agent of the Tucson and El Paso sectors. And before I hand it off to Perla, I just want to note that we received more than 100 questions from you all beforehand. We have a very full agenda. But that said, feel free to ask a question at any point, and you can do so by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and typing it there. All right, over to you, Perla.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you also to begin with to Maureen, Victor, and Andrew for joining us. Maureen, I'm going to start with you. It's been a year since the fire. The Juárez detention center that we mentioned before has been permanently shut down. The Mexican government also temporarily shut down 33 other temporary detention centers. There's a criminal trial ongoing, a couple of them. What did this changes tell you? What does it tell you about where we are with the cooperation with Mexico and who's held accountable when something like this happens?
Thanks, Perla, and thanks for doing so much great work on this tragedy. I wish I could say this is going to be a turning point in how Mexico's Immigration Institute, the INM, actually operates and works to ensure safety for the migrants that are in its care. I hope that is the case. But as you alluded to earlier, there is a history, very well documented, of abuses against migrants by Mexico's immigration agents. Also a history of really poor detention center conditions that Mexico's Human Rights Commission has documented, including fires. There's a recent report that came out by the organizations representing a lot of the families of the victims and the survivors called Don't Let Us Die Here, No Nos Dejen Morir. And, they cited 14 fires that occurred in detention centers during López Obrador's administration, including one that led to the death of a migrant and the injury of 14 others in Tenosique, so in southern Mexico. So this is not, as you had said, an isolated event, and yet all of those recommendations either went unheeded or were not fully implemented, including in the Juárez Center. The fire protocol didn't have guidelines on how do you release people, like the priority of you need to make sure people can be rescued. And so it just shows, I think, a history of impunity for a lot of abuses that have occurred against migrants in Mexico, but also really a lack of ensuring that anyone that's under the Mexican government's custody is being cared for and that their safety is guaranteed at a minimum that you're being held in dignified conditions, are being abused, or you're not going to be blocked in and die from a fire. And so, this hopefully could lead to change. Mexico's elections are this Sunday, so we'll see if there's any possibilities there. But I think it also really does highlight the fact that there has been this history of abuse that both governments know about. You had said, and we certainly as an advocacy organization have worked a lot with the State Department, with our Congress on highlighting the really concerns that we have about human rights violations, abuses against migrants in Mexico, and that if the U.S. is asking Mexico to do more, if it's asking it to step up enforcement efforts, or in this case, also holding a lot of people that are waiting to get to the United States, there are real concerns about how that's happened that the U.S. should take into consideration, and they haven't. And so I think that the thought that you can have a tragedy like this happen, as well as everything else that occurs with migrants mostly waiting to enter the United States, whether that's kidnapping, sexual assault, extortion, and there's no real consequence, shows that both governments aren't really doing what they should to make sure that this is done in a way that, at a minimum, is making sure people aren't further victimized. A lot of asylum seekers, particularly, are not further victimized in their attempt to get to the United States.
Why do you think you mentioned that the U.S. is aware of all of this, but they haven't made changes? Why do you think that this has not led to changes even before the fire, or even if we talk about the fire?
I think you could say both ways. One would be the the US government, well, it's Mexico, the sovereign country. We cooperate with Mexico. The US has certainly worked to increase training and professionalization of Mexico's police agencies into the Immigration Institute. So we raise these concerns with Mexico, but they need to take the steps. But the other is, I think the response that we saw from US officials about the fire, well, migrants should come the right way. Like you should make sure there are these tools at their disposal. They should be waiting at the app. They shouldn't be putting their hands into smugglers. So I think sort of deflecting blame or deflecting responsibility by saying there is a way to do this without looking at the broader context of not everyone is able to access the app, that there are a lot of safety concerns regarding how people get to the border, and that there should be more done. I would say, again, on both sides of the border, to ensure that the system that's set up is where you're working to ensure increased safety for the individuals that are waiting to enter the United States.
And I think when I spoke with you and other experts for this story, one thing that I think several of you repeated is that migrant deaths tend to not lead to policy changes, that numbers lead to policy changes. And speaking of numbers, we've recently seen a significant drop of border apprehensions or encounters, which it's not common for this time of the year when we see usually before we get to really hot weather, that's when numbers increase. And part of that is said to be as a result of Mexico's increased enforcement and the cooperation between the Biden administration and the AMLO administration. Victor, can you talk to us a little bit about those numbers? What does it tell us that the numbers are decreasing? We saw, the Del Rio sector at one point was the busiest, then that moved to Tucson and then Yuma, and then you had San Diego for a little bit, which hadn't seen numbers like that in decades. So we're hearing a lot about numbers and going up or down, and Mexico's rolling it. Can you tell us from your experience and from your point of view, what does it tell us?
Absolutely. When normally when you see the numbers, it's a 50% drop, right? That's usually a great thing, and I would say that's pretty significant. Unfortunately, though, we always lose context. We started that 50% drops compared to the December, and we had historically large numbers in December. We saw it in terms of arrests along the southwest border, and so even with that drop, and if you continue all the way to the end of the fiscal year for the federal government to September 30th, it's estimated that the arrests are going to be around between 1.6 to 1.7 million arrests on that. And you look, well, that's a big drop right from the 2.2 million. Unfortunately, the high water mark was 1.6 million in 2000 for the longest time. The agency never imagined that the numbers would get even higher than that, because even at 1.6, it was pretty crushing to the agency in 2000. And so when the numbers went up, in 2022 and 2023, 2022 of 2.2 million, that's a large number on a daily basis. And you saw the focus point in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, right? We saw the big on that, and you're starting to see that shift to some degree to other areas. But those numbers are again, as a law enforcement perspective, is crushing, because it does a number of things. Is when you've got numbers like that, you have to collapse your operations. You have to vacate areas to handle the flows that come in. And the dynamic has changed. The dynamic used to be that most people try to evade apprehension or detection, as opposed to now we get people who are seeking asylum. So they come up to different areas along the border. We have some famous spots here in El Paso where they know they'll come up and they surrender to claim asylum on that. That doesn't take away from the fact that it takes a large number of resources just to try to deal with that number, right? From transportation to logistics of processing. So it's a massive wave of humanity that we have not seen along the border in a long time. So if I were to put my Border Patrol hat back on, right, when I was in the agency, is that I would, here in El Paso, I would look at the vast majority of our operation would be unpatrolled. And that becomes the danger of a border that's not managed real well.
Why do you think we've seen increases in sectors like you just mentioned El Paso? El Paso for the longest time had not been a busy sector. San Diego had not been a busy sector. What do you think helps explain areas that had not seen that much traffic before all of a sudden become top sectors?
I've learned in the last 35 years that perceptions matter, right? The rhetoric that comes from our elected officials, what's perceived, what's projected, does matter quite a bit. I look at the previous administration, for example, on that there was a talk, the discussion and the talk, right, about the wall, build the wall, build the wall. But if you look at the resources that the U.S. Border Patrol received during that time frame, they weren't all that significant. What was significant was the rhetoric that have come up, and I would venture to guess under the current administration, there's been as much, if not more, resources put into it. But it's perceived that the rhetoric doesn't match on that. And so, and then you couple that with a governor in Texas that's been very vocal, very upfront, very public on what he's trying to do. You think tactically, it doesn't make a lot of operational impact, but the perceptions projected though makes it appear very unfriendly and very unwilling. And that's why you're starting to see some of the flows. I would love to get a hold of some of the data that they use at CBP when they do the fingerprints of individuals, as opposed to, if they were apprehended before, or were they apprehended? And I would guess that the vast majority was in one of the Texas sectors.
And before I move on to Andrew, we do just want to clarify something. So when you mentioned 1.6 million arrests, people are not really being arrested, right? Someone from the audience was asking, that they were entering and asking for asylum. So I think to clarify, when we talk about 1.6 million, we're not talking about necessarily 1.6 million people, but encounters, because someone might be encountered or apprehended at the border more than once, right? So I think we've seen in the rhetoric sometimes talk about millions of people. So I think it's important to differentiate that the data that Border Patrol or CBP shares, it's encounters and not necessarily people. But also if you can clarify the term arrest and whether people are actually being arrested or when they present themselves or seeking asylum.
So when someone makes an entry, either legal or illegal, and it's usually an encounter, right? And so what we're seeing right now is people seeking asylum, the vast majority on that. And so right now CBP classifies that as an encounter, which is probably the most appropriate term they use on that. Now, when we use a number 1.6 or 2.2 million encounters or arrests, doesn't mean that's 2.2 million individuals, right? There might be people that made multiple entries, multiple encounters, and so they could be, double counted 3 times, 4 times on that. And so that is not taking into account the recidivism rate that might be part of this population.
Andrew, Victor was talking about that, right? That when you have large numbers of people come in, even if they're just turning themselves to Border Patrol, or it still requires resources. And I think we've all seen the images, for example, in Del Rio into 2021 with thousands of mostly Haitian migrants. More recently, we saw large groups of people where Border Patrol had to set up basically an open processing air kind of tent area in Eagle Pass. We mentioned the CBP One app before, and the unintended consequences that has left to some people being stranded. On the Mexican side, you're having communities on the U.S. side also dealing with sometimes Border Patrol releasing people to the streets. What would a more orderly process look like?
We're a very long way from that, but that doesn't mean we can't think about what a more orderly process would be and try and build towards it. So I think you want really 3 elements, right? You want people to be able to come on legal pathways, mostly visas, but on some sort of legal pathway to take available jobs. Right now we have 8 to 10 million jobs a month that are open. It's a very tight labor market. So you want some way that your visa system adjusts with the labor market so that people who want to come and take those jobs, who often actually already have a job offer, right? I mean, a lot of people who are even coming across the border unauthorized have a job offer, right? So, but you want a way of connecting the employers with the willing workers, right? We don't have that right now. We're very far from that. We have a system that was built in 1990 that has numbers set in stone by Congress in 1990, 34 years ago in a different economy. So that's one element you have to update. Secondly, you need an asylum system, or actually a refugee system, a protection system, where people who are running for their lives, who are, you know, individually persecuted, or fleeing circumstances that, you know, any normal individual, and, you know, you can stretch a little bit what protection is, and we have in this country, people who are fleeing things that would put their life at danger can get into the United States either through asylum, either by applying at the border, or ideally earlier, right? Ideally actually being able to apply for protection closer to where they live, because the saying to people, if you can, you know, hire a smuggler and get a few thousand miles, we'll consider your application, is not really a great system either, right? So ideally, we want a humanitarian protection system that starts in the region, particularly since we know most people are coming from somewhere in Latin America and the Caribbean, but then has a fail-safe at the border. And you have to be able to return people who don't meet those two characteristics, right? Who aren't coming in on a legal pathway or aren't granted asylum. And you have to make decisions on protection fairly quickly, by the way, right? I mean, efficiently within a space, because you're not, if it takes 4 or 5 years, which is what it takes right now, for most people and sometimes more, to get a decision, you're not giving protection to people who need it, who are afraid of being returned. But you're also creating a pull factor for people who might not have otherwise applied for protection. Thinking 4 or 5 years, they're probably not going to deport me. And they're right? We don't tend to actually remove a lot of people who've been in the country that long. So the final thing is you have to be able to remove people. And right now, we also aren't doing that, right? And the reality is people are coming for lots of reasons right now. I think the active job market is part of it. Some of the chaos in the hemisphere, particularly some of the specific displacement crises in Venezuela and Haiti and Nicaragua, the fact that people are more mobile than ever, that people are now cross the Darien Gap, and they're able to conceive, you know, voyages from different places, from Central Asia, from parts of Africa, where they would never have thought of coming to the United States before. I mean, those are all a big deal. But there is also a piece of this, which is policy, which is people know that if they make it to the US border, they are likely to get in. They're likely to get a notice to appear at an immigration facility in the future. They will lodge an asylum claim if they want, and they will be in stasis for many years, right? And that's a system that doesn't make sense for people who need protection, but it also doesn't make sense from a migration protection standpoint. And what we've done then, as a way of trying to stop this, because we haven't resourced any of these things and we haven't actually fixed any of them, is we then turn to Mexico and other countries along the way and say, let's make it harder for people to get here. At least we'll try and throw stones in their road. And what that does is make it much more dangerous for people. We would be much better off with a system that gave protection, that had legal pathways, but also returned people who don't come through those ways. But we've ended up with a system that simply tries to slow people down.
Yes, go ahead.
On that, Andrew, I think those are great points on that. In fact, when I would host congressional delegations that would come out and talk about what do you need, Chief, there's always resources. And what I've asked was, could you stop treating the border like a singular line on a map? It's an ecosystem.
Right.
And the ecosystem has so many variables, and I think you described that very well.
I have two things in May for both, but starting with Andrew, going back. So I think when you talk to the administration or when you hear Secretary Mayorkas talk, they do point to those legal pathways, right? So they point to the use of the CBP1 app as one. They use the humanitarian parole, and we won't get into all the details of all of them because that would take the rest of our hour. But happy to, if you want to reach out after and to any of us, and we can fill the blanks. But you have the humanitarian parole where people can apply if they're from certain countries to come here. You do have more guest worker visas. So that they're saying that they are working towards that. And you've written about this, I think when we had you here 2 years ago, last year. What has happened, right? So the administration was moving in that direction. What has not, but we're still seeing record numbers. What happened?
So they've really stretched the limits of what they can do with the authorities that the executive branch has to try and create legal pathways. They've tried to increase employer interest in some of the temporary labor pathways. It's increasing in Central America. It's still a drop in the bucket, but it's increasing. They created quite a large pathway for Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans, who are people who can come for 2 years. And those are groups of people where there are displacement crises going on in the country. So it made sense to stretch what they call parole powers, humanitarian parole powers, to allow people to enter the country and have a work permit for 2 years. But they can't really go much further than that on legal pathways. They've tried to speed up asylum, and they've tried to create incentives for people to go to ports of entry to apply for asylum rather than go between ports of entry. But again, without resources, it's really hard to, without authorities, without Congress, it's hard to create legal pathways. Without resources, you can't really do a lot to fix asylum, right? And make it work in an efficient and fair way. And they've tried to remove people, but with the numbers they have, the reality is, the vast majority of people are probably getting across right now. And, again, without resources, it is very hard to remove people also. And so none of these things, I give them credit for effort and for actually understanding that you have to have all those three pieces. But unless Congress gets involved and appropriates money and also provides some authorities, particularly on the legal pathway side, it becomes very hard to get it done. I mean, we saw an attempt by Republicans and Democrats, Senator Langford, Senator Murphy, Senator Sinema, to try and create a very narrow part of this, just dealing with asylum and returns and resources. They didn't touch the legal pathway part, which I thought was we can quibble on the specifics, but I thought it was at least healthy that they were starting to move on some of the elements on this. I don't think you can make it stick without the legal pathways, but yeah, that fell apart. So we're back to where we were.
And speaking of that, I think it's a perfect segue. And stick with me, Andrew, talking about the immigration bills that we're hearing a lot about. Some proposals that have failed. The same bill was just voted on, I think, last week and failed again. Can you walk us a little bit about what that bill would have done? On the one hand, you have the administration and personally President Biden saying we should pass this bipartisan measure. It's the strongest measure that we've considered in a long time. On the other hand, you have some advocates saying that this would really curtail the right to asylum, and it's not moving in the right direction, would do very little to actually solve the problem. Can you walk our viewers and as to what we're talking about and what that would have meant?
I think in very brief terms, we're talking about, it would have codified some of the things they did to restrict asylum, to make it a higher standard for asylum if you cross between ports of entry. That's already there through an executive order, but it's a little cumbersome the way it's set up in the executive order. So it would have streamlined it. It would have put a lot of money into asylum officers and decision-making on asylum, and judges as well for decisions on asylum. It would have put more money into the Border Patrol and into ICE, both for processing people and ICE for returns. But it is, it's something of a Band-Aid, but it's an important Band-Aid. Sometimes Band-Aids are important too, right? I mean, it would have at least created a more virtuous cycle for people who have strong asylum claims to present themselves at the border, and a disincentive for people who know they don't have strong claims. But it's without resources, none of this really matters, by the way. The flip side, let me say also while we're on, I mean, Mexico actually came out, I think it's worth saying, Mexico came out for the first time ever with a national strategy on migration last week. It is actually, I mean, again, great plaudits for doing it, because I think it's something that's needed to be done for a long time. How does Mexico relate to its own diaspora? The 12 million Mexicans that live in the US. How does Mexico deal with irregular migration? How does Mexico deal with asylum seekers in Mexico? And how do they deal with people that want to stay in Mexico and people they want to attract? Very good stuff. Again, like with the US, it's a question also of resources and authorities and how you actually do it. But, want to give them credit, both sides actually credit for having some good ideas, but acknowledge also that on the ground, the actual results aren't necessarily what we'd hope they were.
And speaking of resources, and I'll go to you on this, Victor, I think when we talk about resources, the budget for the Border Patrol and for CBP has been going up considerably, right? And I think from some of the experts I've spoken to, they talk about the need of more resources, for example, for the immigration courts to address the huge backlog, for asylum officers to process these cases, for customs officials at the ports of entry to process people who are coming in through those legal pathways. When you mentioned, resources, Victor, can you talk about your take from your from the point of view from when you were a Border Patrol agent or when you were in charge in your research? In your view, would this bill have addressed some of the issues that you had? And I will just point out that at least the first time around, it was supported by the Border Patrol Union.
Well, when we speak about resources, and that usually it's a wonderful, a wonderful term for government entities, right? They say, hey, we'll give you additional resources, and always wants to be personnel on that. But the problem comes up though is when we do that, we treat what's happening on the border again like a singular line on a map on that, and we forget that it's much deeper than that. And so when they would ask me in Tucson, for example, Chief, do you want more Border Patrol agents? How many more could you use? Well, I had 4,500 Border Patrol agents, which was larger than the agency when I joined nationwide. And he goes, it wasn't those resources. It's, look, if you give me more Border Patrol agents, we will make more arrests, which will have a logistical tail from the U.S. Marshals, the Bureau of Prisons, the court system, the immigration court system. And I go, let's start looking at funding other entities to be able to do this. So resources are not always, let me give you Border Patrol agents, right? On that, there's always going to be a baseline need. And you're absolutely right that the agency's grown significantly. But when I got in the Border Patrol, in the late 80s, there were 4,000 agents nationwide. When I retired from Tucson, I had 4,500 agents alone in Tucson State. So we were such a deep hole. They've been trying to dig themselves out, right? Just to get to a place where you can say, look, we can have under certain numbers a certain semblance of situational awareness of what's occurring, to be able to react, do a proper disposition of all the encounters on that. And so resources, I read the bill, talked about, additional Border Patrol agents. And if I was a sitting chief, I'd say, how about additional immigration judges? How about initial processes to help that flow, right? To be able to adjudicate that quickly. Because one thing's going to happen when you're able to adjudicate these cases rather quickly and fairly, is the flow either is going to increase or it's going to slow down. And I estimate that it'll start to slow down, understanding that there's now a pathway, right? A pathway that now sounds, I won't say reasonable, but they realize, hey, it's within our horizon to be able to do. And that includes policy as well. Again, policy has a big impact on what that ecosystem should look like on that. But as long as we get a big marker and kind of rub down on the border, I think this will just continue to repeat itself over and over.
Maureen, we had several participants being asked about executive action, and I think just recently there's been some reports that following the failure to pass of the bill that we had just been discussing, President Biden was considering some executive action around this issue. Could you give us a brief overview of what sort of executive actions President Biden has taken and is currently considering, and can he do more as some on the right are calling for, or even some on the left as well?
I think a lot of it's already been touched on by Andrew. And actually, if you look at executive actions or orders on migration, even during Biden's first year in office, there were almost 300. So we can't, cover all of them. But I think some of the bigger ones, which Andrew also, mentioned, there was the Remain in Mexico, the migrant protection protocols that was attempted to be canceled the first month of Biden's administration, but then went through lawsuits and was finally able to end after a Supreme Court resolution in June 2022. So therefore, you couldn't be sending asylum seekers back to Mexico to wait for their immigration hearings in the United States. And there's also, I said, Title 42, which was allowing Mexicans and non-Mexicans to be expelled back to Mexico without any pathway to a hearing in the United States. But some of the other bigger ones, and Andrew mentioned these, the parole program. So you have the ability with the humanitarian parole to have over 360,000 people enter the United States every year. if they have a US-based sponsor and a valid passport, and they're coming from Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. So just those 4 nationalities. And so I think a lot of the programs have been, in general, looking at who's coming right now. Like, what are the top nationalities of people, and also where it's very hard for the administration to send people back. I mean, Venezuela would be where there's no diplomatic relations right now. Both Nicaragua and Cuba are very limited in how many deportation flights they have, and clearly Haiti, which the administration has, I think, shockingly sent over 20-some thousand Haitians back to a country that currently does not have a functioning government. But you have a lot of limitations also, and I guess I wanted to flag the challenge with a lot of these, and what Andrew was talking about of the current legal pathways, is they're really nationality based a lot of times and not based on need. And so when you look at the number of who's coming into the border, which includes Mexico, still right now is the top nationality. It's certainly dramatically different than maybe a decade ago, but you still have 25% or more of the people crossing are Mexicans. A lot of those are fleeing violence and persecution too, right? So you have programs that are for certain nationalities and exclude others that might also benefit from expanded legal pathways, or that can't afford to wait too. I mean, if you're in Mexico, you're not really, if you're fleeing the country that you're persecuted and you'd like to be able to enter the United States as quickly as you can. And I think I wanted to flag 2 things. One, the limits that the administration has, which both Victor and Andrew have alluded to in terms of resources, and not just resources at the border, but then resources for the entire immigration system, especially to go through the asylum backlog. And so that's something that Congress needs to move forward with, just like Congress would need to move forward with any immigration reform that would have legalization for any of the broader population that is here. But the other, I think, recognizing the limits and what the Biden administration has been able to do on legal pathways, they've also tried to have a much more regional approach to migration, recognizing not everybody wants to come to the United States or should. And so I think if you look at the assistance that has been given to Latin American countries, over $2.4 billion in assistance, a lot looking at supporting countries' asylum systems, support for refugees, or as Andrew knows well, the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection, which was signed by 22 governments at the Summit of the Americas held in Los Angeles in 2022. It was a real effort by the administration to look at this from, this is a regional issue. There are commitments a lot of governments need to take on in the region, both in terms of expanding their own legal pathways as well as humanitarian protection. And that it's also a way to look at not just the US as the only destination country. I think it's worth flagging that Colombia has 2.9 Venezuelans at least living in a country that has 52 million people population-wise. So it's not just a challenge the United States is grappling with. And I think the administration has recognized, given its own limits, trying to really encourage other countries. I think the flip side is also push them more on enforcement and other measures that are, as Andrew said, working to slow down how people get here and oftentimes requiring them or forcing them to take more dangerous routes.
I think, I don't know if Andrew and Victor want to take this or one of you, but we've been hearing a lot about a crisis, right? And either Biden's crisis, the border crisis. On the one hand, we're being invaded. On the other hand, nothing's going on. We've had a lot of people who reach out to us saying, is there a crisis or is there not a crisis? And what does that entail? So, let's start maybe with you, Victor, from a more law enforcement perspective. Is there really a crisis? And what do we mean by that? And I'll just quickly say that you actually recently hosted former Vice President Pence in El Paso, who was there also for a panel discussion on this issue. So we know it's top of mind for a lot of people. What's your take?
If I had a Border Patrol hat on right now, I'd go retire, right? Just because of the volume. When you look from the law enforcement perspective, and what you're trying to do is really, it comes down to risk mitigation. What it comes down to is reducing the risk of the unknown coming in and not knowing where they're going on that. And you can't do that right now. You can't do that with the large numbers, but what I would consider chaos and clutter. And so when I'm asked that question, Is this a crisis? And it is a crisis in terms of what a law enforcement on the border has to do. And really what they have to do is detect that entry, identify and classify that, respond and resolve it. And so when you have people who are seeking asylum, who are giving up, right? So we have a good identity of who they are. It's when you have to collapse your operations and give up miles of area you can control, that's where the real risk comes up. Then that becomes a real danger. So it isn't the encounters that would worry me as much. It's the areas that I couldn't get to and the unknown, right? What we would refer to as known getaways at that time. So yeah, yes, ma'am, I would definitely call this a crisis.
Andrew, your thoughts?
I mean, I think the American public overwhelmingly thinks it's a crisis, right? I mean, it is, if you look at polls, there are at least 4 that came out recently that all tell us exactly the same story, which is that Americans are quite pro-immigration. They actually think immigration is good for the country. It's gone down a little bit, but it's still pretty high. We're actually one of the countries in the world where the vast majority of people actually think immigration is a good thing. Actually, a lot of people are immigrants, children of immigrants, spouses of immigrants. You know, that immigration is part of who we are. It's part of our DNA. Yes, there are a few people who hate immigrants out there, but the vast majority of Americans actually think immigration is a good thing. But they're also really worried about the border, right? And this cuts across party lines now. This is not just yes, there's a partisan divide. Republicans are more concerned about the border than Democrats, but Democrats have moved on this issue as of independence. And I think when you have a system that can't make distinctions about who should come into the country, that undermines the credibility of your immigration system. And it then makes people much more worried about immigration in general, much less willing to support things like legal pathways that would actually help. Is it a crisis in the sense of, I say it's sort of like North Korean nukes. I mean, it's not going to destroy our country. We do a lot of research on how immigrants are doing in the US, and it turns out they're doing really well. Children of immigrants are, in fact, almost all the labor force growth in the United States, in fact, all of it right now is either from immigrants or their children. Children of immigrants are doing incredibly well in school. We don't have a crisis in terms of our well-being as a society, but we do have a crisis in terms of being able to make decisions about who comes in and keep some sort of control of our immigration policy. And I'm worried if we don't figure this part out and be able to be able to say that, most people, sure, some people always slip through the cracks, but most people are coming in through an orderly process, right? People care about order. So, through an orderly process, we've decided they need protection. They've come with a visa or other legal way of coming in, or they're getting returned, but this is the process, or we've brought them from somewhere else because they have someone that can sponsor them, like the CHNB program, or they're a refugee that's being resettled. I mean, people are coming in through a predictable way. Unless we can say that most people are coming that way, what we're going to see in this country is a backlash against immigration in general that will hurt all of us, not just immigrants. It'll hurt our economy as well.
Isn't it that? Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, Perla. I mean, I just think it's important to add that in all of this, and I think as the administration looks at how do you reduce the numbers at the border so that it doesn't seem like it's a crisis, what you end up having is a crisis, a humanitarian crisis on the Mexican side of the border too, that I think is really important to sort of focus on. The fact that as numbers have dropped here, especially since last December, I mean, Mexico is encountering over 120,000 migrants a month right now in Mexico, and it seems to be mostly busing them around the country to keep them away from the border. And so what you have is a crisis that you're sort of exporting farther south. And so where you see Mexico City having a huge housing challenge for the number of asylum seekers that are waiting there for CBP1 appointment, or they already have an appointment and they're just waiting for their turn. But especially in northern Mexico, where you have thousands of people waiting. And so that really taxes resources there. It puts them at risk. And I think we could say the flip side in the United States, when you have thousands of people coming into local communities without having a federal coordinated response with state and local governments about what types of resources you need, then you have images that do look more like a crisis. People sleeping in bus stations or plane or airports, instead of really dedicating the resources so that those people can quickly settle into communities, that they can get work permits, and then they can have a more contribution to the communities where they're living, instead of feeling like you're becoming a burden.
I do want to quickly move to the elections before we run out of time, but just to clarify and correct me, any of you can correct me if I'm wrong, people, when they turn themselves into Border Patrol or come through the port of entry, do go through a background check before they're being released, right? So at least in terms of the people who are turning themselves in would go through some sort of check before being released into the US to continue their cases?
Limited one. Victor, you probably know this better than me. I mean, there's a very cursory background check to see if there are any hits in, you know, in criminal databases, if they have outstanding deportation orders. It's not a very, I mean, simply because the processing time isn't available, right? People are being processed with very few, and I like Victor's point about the ecosystem. I mean, you know, there is sort of an ecosystem that's strained overall. It's not just, I mean, it's the Border Patrol, it's the what's called the OFO agents, the people at the ports of entry. They're, you know, it's everyone. It's the asylum system. It's the judges and the immigration courts. The whole thing is stretched, but the processing times are so fast. My understanding is there is a basic background check, but it's not an extensive one.
And that's correct, Andrew. It's not extensive. You know, it's a reliance when people come in, right? Part of the booking information, fingerprints, stuff like that. They run into databases. They rely on, most individuals will toss their IDs and stuff of that nature. So you take their name, you take the name and date of birth, face value, you run those. They don't come up with anything in most cases on that. And so the ones that really kind of pop up on a check may be either a prior administrative action, could have been deportation, it could have been something of that nature, or someone that might have entered previously in the United States and had a criminal record in the United States, be it, you know, really low, very high, and they've returned on that. So I would not put a heavy reliance on those type of checks at this point.
Again, we haven't had a lot of incidents. I mean, there haven't been incidents of terrorists getting across, right? So the other side, I mean, it's not that, you know, all chaos is breaking loose and, you know, so far it's been manageable, but is it the way you'd want to run the railroad? Is it is it sort of, can you actually say with confidence, you know, we're checking everyone in a detailed way? Not really. Maureen, sorry.
I think no. Yeah. So you know, we are approaching the election. Immigration, as we have mentioned, is a top issue for voters. On the one hand, you have President Biden pushing for this sort of bill. Some would say that he has hardened his position on immigration a bit. On the other hand, you have Trump saying that he would call for mass deportations, potential return to the so-called Remain in Mexico policy. And I'll start with you, Maureen. What, you know, heading into November and past the election, what do you expect to see around immigration?
Well, I think in terms of the Biden administration, we will continue to see a harder line policy. I mean, I think to have Biden come out maybe February of this year, I will shut down the border if you give me that authority, is a very, you know, significant shift from when he took office. Looking at immigration reform and a much more welcoming stance, in part because the numbers have, you know, gotten so high, and I think a lot of the management challenges that have been alluded to here. So I think between now and the elections, we will likely see one, ongoing work and pressure with Mexico on this. Presidents Biden and López Obrador spoke a few weeks ago and really talked about how they're going to increase enforcement to reduce the number of migrants reaching the border. So real pressure on Mexico. Again, Mexico's elections are this Sunday. I'm sure we will expect conversations right after of what is the president-elect who takes office in October, what is her stance, likely the two leading candidates are women, going to be in cooperating with the United States. And Andrew can talk more about how their policies might shift or not with the new president. But I think pressure on Mexico and farther north or south, excuse me. There was a migration meeting in Guatemala on May 9th, also looking at some of the regional protections, but also border security, increasing visa restrictions. So looking farther south to reduce the numbers while they are trying to expand some of these legal pathways. There's these safe mobility offices in Colombia, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Guatemala that are meant precisely to process people for refugee resettlement or other legal pathways to try to reduce the number of people coming here. Post-elections, I think we hopefully, if it is a Biden second term, see a more shift back to expanding legal pathways, improving the system, adding more resources, addressing a lot of the shortcomings that we're seeing now. I think, and a continuation of these programs, especially the regional programs. I think with Trump second term. We saw the first term, canceling refugee resettlement numbers or dramatically lowering them, canceling programs that Biden restarted, like the Central America's Minors Parole Program, to building more wall, to, as you said, increased mass deportation. So I think it's a very contrasting view of the situation at the border and in terms of the contributions migrants make to the United States, or how to address the undocumented population here, that will have stark differences come January 2025, depending on the results of the elections.
Andrew, Victor, any quick thing? I know we're running out of time, and this might not be fair to either of you. Any quick additions to what Maureen just said?
I would just say that we tend to treat this as a political football, and either you want immigrants or you don't. And the reality of the American public is much more nuanced. The American public wants immigrants, but they also want to know how they're coming into the country. They want to know there's a legal process, and it would behoove both parties to figure out. Democrats tend to err on the side of not worrying about the control side. Republicans, overshoot on the other side of trying to shut it all down. But the American public's really in the middle of both of those, right? And I think actually most Republicans and Democrats are in the middle of that. They're not where the extremes are. They want to see robust immigration. They know the country needs it, but they also want to know that there's a system that actually can make a decision about who comes in and can justify that decision. And we're not there right now. And the alternative tends to be, well, we can't figure it out ourselves. We then go back and push Mexico and other countries to do it for us, and we end up with things like in Ciudad Juárez.
Pearl, real quick, what I think is really dynamic and interesting this time around, maybe in the last 35 years, is that now you have Middle America really vested in this issue. On that, I would venture to guess in the last 35 years or so, it's been really considered a four-state border problem. And now that you see delegations from other parts of the country really interested in this. So I think that's a twist that's very interesting.
Thank you all. I'll hit back to Connor.
Yeah, no, thank you guys so much. That was really a tremendous conversation. We covered a lot of ground. Unfortunately, that's about our time for today. I want to thank each of our speakers, Andrew, Maureen, and Victor, for lending your insights on this timely issue. Thanks to the Texas Tribune for partnering with us on this event. And a big thanks to everyone who tuned in. Again, this is the first in a three-part series, so you can expect more down the pipeline later this summer. I also wanted to quickly plug, we have an event next week called The Legacy of Segregation Academies. That'll be next Wednesday. So if you enjoyed this, please consider signing up for that. I just dropped a link in the chat and also include a link to that in my follow-up email. This event was recorded, and you'll also get that from me in a couple days as well. So thanks again. Thanks to you all. Big thanks to the audience, and enjoy the rest of your day.